On the Rolling Stones as much as we had on the Beatles, okay? Now, how many of you have heard of the Rolling Stones? Okay, who's the main man you've heard of? Mick Jagger, okay? Now, the first lineup of the Rolling Stones had 6 members, and they're all on your ID sheet. You can take it for what it's worth. Brian Jones, who played the guitar and harmonica. Ian Stewart played the piano. Brian Jones, guitar and harmonica. Ian Stewart played the piano. And again, I'm going to go a little quicker. You decide if you want to jot them on your sheet. I'm not sure. Bill Wyman played bass. Charlie Watts played drums. And probably the headliners were Keith Richards, who played guitar, one of the greatest guitars in rock and roll history, by the way. The guy has taken more drugs than you can imagine, is still surviving, which amazes me. And Mick Jagger, who was lead vocals and harmonica. So the first lineup, known as the Rolling Stones, which, by the way, was formed in London in 1962. London in 1962. For Brian Jones, guitar and harmonica, Ian Stewart, piano, Bill Wyman, bass, Charlie Watts, drums, Keith Richards, guitar, and Mick Jagger, lead vocals and harmonica. That was the original Rolling Stones. Anybody know how many members are now at this present day? How many members the Rolling Stones have? 4. And they are Jagger, Richards, Watts, and a guy by the name of Ronnie Wood. So presently there's only 4 members of the Rolling Stones: Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts, and then Ronnie Wood joined the group. Now don't write any of this down, just kind of pay attention. Brian Jones, the original member, actually left the band in 1969, and he accidentally drowned in his pool at his home not long after that. Okay? A guy by the name of Mick Taylor actually replaced Jones, but he left the band in 1975, and that's when Ronnie Wood came on the scene. And Stewart, the piano player, was actually removed from the band in 1963. They fired him, and then Wyman left in 1993, which was fairly recent. Okay. Again, we talked about albums versus singles, and I'll kind of get through this. The Rolling Stones' first single was entitled "Come On," and it was released on June 7th, 1963. Their first single was "Come On," and it was released on June 7th of 1963. Well, they took the American tour route in June of '64, and it was tabbed a disaster. Okay, the Rolling Stones first toured America in June of 1964, and it was tabbed a disaster. So they weren't exactly a big-time hit in the early 60s. So they did an American tour in June of '64, was tabbed a disaster. In August of 1964, guess what show they performed on? The Ed Sullivan Show. And they were banned from his show. They didn't quite perform up to his expectations. Well, after they got a little bit more famous and got their stuff maybe together better, he did invite them back, but he banned them for a long period of time. Well, they did get an international hit single in 1965, and it was called, you might have heard the song, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." Anybody heard of that one? You want to sing a little for us? Anybody heard of it? I can't get no satisfaction. That was it. That was their first hit song. And their second was "Get Off of My Cloud." So they did come up with 2 pretty big hit singles in '65. The first one, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," the second one, "Get Off of My Cloud." Now, if you ever go to a Rolling Stones concert, and they still do tour, you hear songs that they recorded from 1968 to 1972, for the most part, because that's when a majority of their best hits were recorded. So people remember them for that, okay? In the 70s, they were a little bit of a turnoff. From like 1972 to 1978, they got into drugs, especially Keith Richards. Man, that guy he's incredible. But anyway, they got into drugs and had a lot of troubles, and they tried to tour in Japan, and they were denied permission because of their actions. They were banned in Australia. People weren't having them perform because of some of the issues they were having, a lot of them with drugs. So the band really started to turn people off from 72 to 78. And I mentioned back in the notes before, I told you not to write it down, but I mentioned that Rick Taylor left the band in 1975, and the reason he left was because he got tired of all this negative energy that was going around the band, so he quit. Well, they started getting their stuff together, and they got kind of a renewed popularity from 1978 to 1982. So they did real well from 68 to 72. They turned people off from 72 to 78. And from 78 to 82, they got their stuff going again, and people started to get interested in it. And they appeared on another more modern famous show that you might have heard of that kind of took over and away for the Ed Sullivan Show. Anybody know what people watched on Saturday night? And they always had a musical, Saturday Night Live. You ever watch that? Some people, it's a lot different, but they appeared on Saturday Night Live, which was a big show in the late 70s and 80s. And that kind of helped their popularity as well, because that was kind of like the Ed Sullivan Show of the late 70s and 80s. Well, between 1982 and 1989, there was virtually no Rolling Stones because of a huge conflict between which two members, do you think? The more famous ones. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Okay? They had trouble. So there really was no touring. There was no Rolling Stones from 82 to 89. Well, they came back in 1989 for a ceremony, and then they got back together and are fairly popular now, singing songs that they had recorded back in those years. What event do you think they got them together? It might be hard to guess, but they were given a big-time award, and they had to come together to play at that award ceremony. What would it be? Anybody know? The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989, and in order to do that, you have to come together. I don't know if you've ever watched those. They have them every year on HBO. They're pretty cool if you're into music. And then, like Green Day went in last year. Okay? But a lot of these bands that go in are broke up. And so what they do is they come back, and some of them play for the first time in decades back on this particular show. So in 1989, they came back together. They got rid of their differences between Jagger and Richards. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and then started a new album and became really popular to the point where they are today. Okay? Anybody know where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is located? Where? You might be surprised. What's that? You'd think maybe Memphis, but that's the Country Music Hall of Fame. No, you think of a big city. Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
When we flew to Florida, we stopped in the Cleveland, Ohio airport, and they had like this huge guitar in the airport that says home of the...
Yeah, you wouldn't think that's the home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but it is, Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, that's our story on the Rolling Stones. Okay? We'll move on now to fashions in the 1960s, and I'll give you a few examples. And we'll talk about fashion for women first, okay? Fashion for women. Does anybody know the most noticeable fashion statement in the 1960s? I think I told you. No, for women. The miniskirt. The miniskirt. And the person that really introduced the miniskirt to women in America was this gal right here, up on the top. Her name was Leslie Lawson, better known as Twiggy. Okay, she was a very famous model. Leslie Lawson, or Twiggy, was the gal that really introduced America to the miniskirt. So a young popular model by the name of Leslie Lawson, better known as Twiggy, first introduced the miniskirt to people in America. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She was actually born in London, England in 1949, so she's English. Okay, she was born in London, England in 1949. And she really, if you heard of these supermodels, she became the world's first supermodel at the age of 16. She became the world's first supermodel as we know it today at the age of 16. And this happened in the mid-1960s. Happened in the mid-1960s. She became the world's first supermodel at the age of 16. And she was so popular and so attractive that she modeled into her 50s very successfully. Okay? So she was so popular and kept her figure, so to speak, to be a model, that she was kind of what they call a timeless beauty. I mean, she just really aged well and modeled into her 50s. She also became a successful actress during that time. A very, very popular model. So that's the first thing. Then you always, in the 60s, have to go the opposite. So what was the next fashion statement after the mini skirt? The maxi skirt, where skirts then were worn down to the ankles. That became very popular. So before the mini skirt, girls wore skirts that were, you know, a little bit over the knees. That was considered appropriate. Then in the 60s, they, you know, maxed up, so to speak, to the mini skirt, and then maxed down, so to speak, to the maxi skirt. So that became popular, long dresses. Okay? So it went from the mini skirt to the maxi skirt, which went to a woman's ankle. Another thing that became very popular for women in the 60s was knee-length boots. Okay, those would be boots that would come up. Are those kind of coming back a little bit?
Not knee-length.
Not so much knee-length, but knee-length boots. And there was one particular actress and singer who really popularized knee-length boots, and that was Nancy Sinatra. Does the name ring a bell? Frank Sinatra's daughter. So she was kind of the spokesman for knee-length boots. She was a singer and actress, and she wrote a famous one-hit wonder. What's a one-hit wonder? One hit, you don't ever hear from them again. And her one hit was, "These boots are made for walking." You ever heard it? These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. You better watch out, or these boots will walk over you, or some of that thing. But it was a very, one of these days these boots, hey, Mauricio knows it, one of these days these boots walk over. Yeah, anyway, that was the big song that opened the doors for a whole new category of fashion and rock. Now I tell you the Katie Onstead story, you can look her up on Facebook, I forget what her married name is, but Katie was a student of mine in Fort Benton. And she bought 3 or 4 pairs of these knee-length boots when we were in D.C. and mailed them home. And so when she commented on the D.C. trip, she always has to make a comment about her knee-length boots. But they were a big thing, and they made a little bit of a comeback. Now, Nancy Sinatra was kind of the tough girl. You ever heard of the old rebel chick rocker? Who's probably the most famous rebel chick rocker of all time? Just got inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Anybody know? Sang Crimson and Clover. Joan Jett. Very good. Joan Jett. So really Nancy Sinatra was the first tough girl attitude, first rebel chick rocker, you know. But she's the one that kind of made knee-length boots popular. Now this next eye-popping fashion, I'm not making this up and it probably isn't totally appropriate, but I think you need to know, a guy invented, guys you'll like this, the topless bathing suit for women. I'm not making this up. Topless bathing suit. Would you like to see an example? Life in the 60s. No, I'm not making this up. Look at the expression on this poor girl's face when she holds it up. Here's your topless bathing suit expression. And here's your topless bathing suit. Honest to God. This was a fashion. What? Yeah. Yeah. Now, it was designed by Rudy Gernreich. Rudy Gernreich. Rudy Gernreich was the guy that invented the topless bathing suit in the 60s. Rudy Gernreich. No. But what did it symbolize, which we talked about in the counterculture? What did it symbolize? The sexual revolution, no question about it. So the suit was designed by Rudy Gernreich, and it symbolized without question the sexual revolution in the 1960s. Sales were a little slow on it though, however. Very few women purchased them, just so you know. But it was a fashion. Now, I'm not making this up, but I don't have a picture, and I'm glad I don't. Some geniuses in the 1960s to get sales up, actually, in the western part of the United States, employed bottomless waitresses in their restaurants. No lie. Bottomless waitresses. I don't have a picture of it. I'm glad I don't. I don't know how the sales were, but that was another symbol of the sexual revolution. In Midwestern parts of the United States, women actually were waitresses in that attire. Nope, I'm not making that up. Okay? Moving on to fashions for men. Moving on for fashions for men. Now, the men had really their own fashion statement. I'll give you 4 examples of fashion statements for men. I can remember these a little bit because they went into the 70s. A big fashion statement for men in the 60s was the tight-waisted suit. Ever see a tight-waisted suit? Aren't suits a little baggy now, supposed to give comfort? In the 60s, these suits were tight-waisted. They kind of went like this and like this, right to the waist. So your waist was defined. They weren't baggy, they were tight-waisted suits. And that was a big fashion statement in the 60s and early 70s, were these tight-waisted suits which emphasized a man's torso, so to speak. Also, it was mentioned by, I think, Mauricio, bell-bottom trousers. Man, I'll tell you what, if you had a pair of hash jeans, no drug implications intended, that wasn't the point. They were called hash jeans, and they had a sunrise on the pocket. I mean, this is what they had on the pocket. And if you had a pair of those that were bell-bottoms, you were all it, I'll tell you, in the 1976 even. So hash jeans, bell-bottom trousers, they went down straight and then they had a big bell-bottom. You've probably seen them before. They were huge. They were also pretty big for women also, but trousers weren't that much accepted for women yet, but there were girls that wore them. Anybody know another thing that came out for fashions? Sideburns became big. Okay, you remember Stetson Curtis would come up with a lamb chop sideburn at times, you know, it comes down like this or whatever. Sideburns were really big. They were really big in the 60s. Facial hair was pretty big, but sideburns, if you look at a lot of the 70s rockers, a lot of 70s rockers had sideburns and mustaches and goatees. And men even came to the point of wearing fur coats, which was totally a woman's thing. You know who the first man ever to publicly wear a fur coat was? What? Joe Namath. Who was Joe Namath?
He was a football player.
Joe Namath was a very famous football player for the New York Jets. Okay, a little bit about him in a minute. He was a star professional football quarterback for the New York Jets in the 1960s. He played at the University of, he played at the University of Alabama for legendary coach Bear Bryant, who was maybe the strictest, hardest-ass guy you could ever coach for. He was clean cut. He got kicked off the team for doing things he shouldn't, come back to the team, led him to a Sugar Bowl victory. And at that time, you had 2 different leagues. You had the NFL and the AFL. And the AFL was kind of a new league that came out that was competing against the NFL. And what was the big first competition? Trying to sign what? The best players coming out of college. Well, what happened is the New York Jets stole Joe Namath from the University of Alabama, and he signed with the AFL. He was called the $400,000 quarterback. Became the highest paid player in either league, making $400,000 not a year, $400,000 total, which was a lot of money in those days. And he went to this rival AFL, and because of his signing with the AFL, that led to other star players either jumping from the NFL to the AFL for more money, or college players signing with the AFL, which came to the point that made up what we know today as the Super Bowl. Because the first Super Bowl wasn't an NFL Super Bowl. It was the old NFL versus this new AFL, okay? And the Green Bay Packers played the Kansas City Chiefs. Green Bay, the big dynasty in the NFL, Kansas City, the AFL. Green Bay crushed them. They have another, it wasn't even called Super Bowl one, it's called the first World Championship game. Okay, the next year they have another game. Champions of the NFL play champions of the AFL, and the Green Bay Packers kick the hell out of the Oakland Raiders. And they're thinking about not having any more of these games because they're so lopsided that this AFL can't compete. Then comes 1969, Super Bowl III, the first time they used the name. Charles Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs of the AFL, was sitting at breakfast one day and his son was driving him nuts with this bouncy ball. He kept bouncing this bouncy ball. Finally, his dad took the ball from him and he looked at it, and what were these bouncy balls first called when they were made in the 60s? The Super Ball. And he looked at that and he go, ah, Super Bowl. And Lamar Hunt was the one that came up with the name Super Bowl. Anyway, so Super Bowl III, the New York Jets of the AFL are playing the Baltimore Colts of the NFL. And the Colts are 18-point favorites in a World Championship game, a Super Bowl game. The Jets have no chance. None. Baltimore's like 15-1. They're just killing everybody. The odds makers have an 18-point favorite. The week before the Super Bowl, the big hype, Joe Namath stands up in front of the press and says, I'm tired of listening to you guys saying we don't have a chance. We're going to win the game. I guarantee it. Oh, you can imagine what the headlines were, right? The Baltimore Colts players were so confident of victory, you get a winner's share and a loser's share when you win the Super Bowl. Some of them already spent the winner's share to remodel their house or buy a new car or buy a new house. They were that confident. Joe Namath takes the Colts to task that day. They beat the Colts 16-7.